Year 1610. On the cold stone floor, a young maid tries to wipe away the blood seeping through the cracks with trembling hands. Every move she makes is a shudder of fear and despair. Behind her stands Countess Elizabeth Bathory, robed in crimson velvet, silent, cold, and shadowed by a holy ritual. She drags her fingers through the fresh blood on her skin as if performing an ancient, magical rite. Was this devotion, madness, or darkness itself? This woman, who would go down in history as the Blood Countess, is not merely a figure of fear. She is a being into whom real blood, pain, and savagery are buried. Her story, unlike fictional horror tales, is a nightmare written with concrete testimonies and evidence. So, what created the monster? Was it a congenital curse etched into her very bones? Or was it a transformation woven by time, trauma, power, and privilege? To understand Elizabeth Bathory, one of the most terrifying female killers to ever stain the pages of history, we must rewind time, before the tortures, the dark rooms, and the screams, to where it all began. Born in 1560, Elizabeth was not a victim, but a noble member of one of Hungary's most prominent and powerful families. Blood, violence, and horror ran in her veins. Her family was composed of warlords, bishops, and power brokers. Her cousin led brutal campaigns into Ottoman lands, while her uncle was steeped in dark magic and alchemy experiments. Elizabeth's childhood was not spent in the shadows of fear, but on an open stage. She witnessed the executions of peasants, public mutilations, and brutal whippings. She perceived these not as horrors, but as a part of justice, tradition, and entertainment. Elizabeth was born into a dark dance of blood and seizures. Some historians suggest she suffered from epilepsy or seizures inherited from noble inbreeding. The treatments of the time, however, would put modern horror stories to shame. The blood of a peasant would be smeared on the lips of a child having a seizure, for it was believed that the blood held sacred, healing powers. And these grim traditions were not limited to that. In noble families, children were given authority over their servants, encouraged to punish them, test their obedience, and assert their dominance. Elizabeth didn't invent cruelty. It was her inheritance from the moment she was born. At 10, she was engaged to a powerful nobleman, and at 15, she was bound by marriage. Ferenc Nadasdy, known in Hungary as the Black Knight, was the merciless lord of the battlefield. Their union was not one of love, but a cold, calculated alliance that merged two powerful bloodlines. As a wedding gift, she received Countess Castle. Within its dark and icy stone walls in the Carpathians, history began to write its most ominous chapter. While Ferenc was away at war, Elizabeth became the mistress of the estate. She managed the servants, oversaw the farms, and commanded the soldiers. But this wasn't management. It was a reign, terrifying and merciless. And the whispers began to spread. A girl was beaten with a hairbrush, her face left bloody. Another was left to freeze all night in a frigid room for spilling wine. The servants said the Countess took pleasure in inflicting pain. This was not discipline. It was the manifestation of a monster's sadistic desires. Some also recount that Ferenc, upon returning from war, taught her the gruesome tortures of the battlefield, placing oiled paper between fingers and setting it ablaze, or pushing needles under fingernails. Elizabeth was no longer just a countess. She had become the mistress of a dark throne of pain and blood. These accounts were not whispers from a dark labyrinth of fiction, but testimonies that echoed from the icy corridors of reality. They were words that came to life years later in court records. And then Anna Darvulia entered the scene. Some called her a witch, others a midwife. But when Anna moved into the castle, Elizabeth changed. Her coldness settled like a shadow, and her violence turned into a ritualized darkness. Elizabeth no longer just punished, she experimented, weighing pain like an art form and drawing the boundaries with blood. People vanished, and the rooms filled with silent screams. No one knows exactly when Elizabeth stepped into murder, but the rumors began to whisper long before her arrest. Girls who entered the castle never returned. According to one legend, a young maid mistakenly pulled Elizabeth's hair while brushing it. In a rage, the Countess slapped her. Blood splattered on her hand. But she noticed that the skin beneath the blood was smooth and young. To us, this may seem absurd, but in a world of plague and primitive medicine, where a woman's youth meant power, marriage, and survival, this logic was the cold touch of a nightmare. Elizabeth wasn't merely obsessed with beauty. She was making blood a sacred tool for survival. Over time, witnesses would later reveal that Elizabeth had a notebook. The names of hundreds of girls were written in it, a list of fear and death. Most were peasants, lured to the castle with promises of work, only to be chained in the underground dungeons. Some suffered until they were bled dry, others died from torture. All of this was a hidden, silent grave in the shadows. This was not justice for the people. It was a massacre carried out behind stone walls in the darkness of night. Historians believe she committed her first verified murder around 1609, but some whisper that this horror began much earlier, under the guise of discipline. The violence didn't change. Elizabeth's confidence did. As her cruelty grew, her shadows became bolder. Every torture, every drop of blood, fortified her reckless courage and her cold-blooded fear. In this dark tale, where throne and blood merged, Elizabeth was no longer just a countess. She was the night itself, the embodiment of darkness. More blood, more corpses, more terrified witnesses. And then, she made a fatal mistake. She turned her focus not just to peasants, but to noble girls. The nobles could ignore the deaths of peasants, but never their own daughters. Did Elizabeth care? Not at all. Her wealth, lands, and powerful allies had been her shield. Who would dare accuse a countess of murder? And so, her experiments in pain and cruelty turned into rituals. The image that most captivated people was this: a woman in a tub filled with blood, her eyes closed, believing she was attaining immortality. This legend was powerful and terrifying. But was it true? The story of Elizabeth Bathory bathing in the blood of virgins has remained one of history's most chilling images. It's gruesome, shocking, and unforgettable, yet it was likely never true. The earliest versions appeared after her death, not in court records or witness testimonies, but in pamphlets and plays written for entertainment, exaggeration, and scandal. So, if she didn't truly bathe in blood, where did this terrible rumor originate? Some historians believe it was symbolic. Witnesses testified that Elizabeth would smear blood on her face, hands, and neck. She didn't get into a tub, but consecrated herself with it like an elixir, a dark and deadly enchantment. Others believe this legend served a more sinister purpose. The more monstrous she appeared, the easier it was to seize her power and destroy her name. If the people believed she was a demon, who would object when her lands and wealth were taken? Demonize her, legitimize her downfall. And the truth is still dark, still horrible. Servants testified that girls were hung by their ankles, their throats were slit, and their blood was drained into buckets. As silence was broken by the ominous scream of blood, the castle walls held these dreadful secrets throughout history. Some spoke of iron branding tools, cruel needles, and even human bites. One witness whispered that Elizabeth forced a girl to eat parts of her own flesh, and these were not mere gossip. They were sworn testimonies. Real people, under oath, recounted the horrors that took place in the shadows of the stone corridors. It's unclear if Elizabeth truly believed in blood magic, but her obsession was with control, pain, and eternal youth. Within the stone walls of Countess Castle, no one was safe from her hunger and ambition. Behind those thick, dark walls, time seemed to stand still. For the girls inside, days bled into nights, some begging for death, others silently saying goodbye to this world. The rooms were embroidered with dark stains of blood. Hooks hung from the ceilings, and iron tools and wooden torture racks lurked in the shadows of the stone chambers. Witnesses describe how naked girls were left to freeze in snow-covered fields, their fingers pierced with needles and their skin flayed, and their bodies marked with hot irons. A servant whispered that a girl's mouth was sewn shut with horsehair strings for saying the wrong word. Another said Elizabeth, like a wild animal, bit off pieces of a girl's shoulder. These weren't random acts. They had become a painful pattern, a systematic ritual. And Elizabeth was not alone. She had loyal accomplices, those who lured the victims, who wiped away the blood, and who participated in the tortures. They were all part of the dreadful system carried out under the shadows of that dark castle. Ilona Jew, Dorota Senes, Katerina Benica, and Anna Darvulia, always waiting in the shadows. Each was a part of Elizabeth's terrifying order. Some scoured the villages, tricking innocent girls with promises of work and gold for their families. Others cleaned the bloodstains from the stone floors in the horror of the night. Some directly participated in the tortures, and even among the most loyal servants, there was a trembling fear. One witness recounted that Elizabeth would calmly eat her meal while a girl screamed in agony beside her, the screams echoing down the stone corridors. Another testified that she laughed as she further broke the legs of a girl who was trying to crawl with broken legs. For her, pain was a game, and death was entertainment. So why did no one stop her? Because the victims were peasants, worthless beings in the eyes of the nobles, lifeless figures left in the shadows. As long as the dead were poor, nameless girls, Elizabeth was untouchable. But that silence slowly began to crack with the courage of whispers and escaping victims. By 1610, the rumors had grown too big to be ignored. Too many girls had disappeared, too many eyes had witnessed. Hungarian authorities launched an official investigation, and what they uncovered became one of the darkest collections of testimonies in European history. More than 300 people were questioned: servants, peasants, priests, even some lower nobility. The things they recounted were a nightmare echoing within the stone walls. A former servant said she saw mutilated bodies piled up in the castle basement, their faces horribly twisted, their limbs broken at unnatural angles. Darkness and death seemed to have come to life in this stone labyrinth ruled by Elizabeth. The accounts of other witnesses were horrifying. Girls would crawl down the cold corridors of the stone walls begging for help, only to be dragged back into the depths of darkness and disappear. Some bodily remains were found in shallow graves in the shadowy depths of nearby forests. Others were never buried at all. The sharp, pungent smell of decaying flesh filled the palace, unsettling the mind and stomach. And finally, even those most loyal to Elizabeth betrayed her, whether from their own fear, guilt, or simple instinct for survival. Ilona Jew, who had served her for many years, told the investigators that Elizabeth showed an obsessive meticulousness in choosing her victims. Young, beautiful girls, especially virgins, had been her favorites. And she didn't just watch the torture. She inflicted it with her own hands. In every blow, every cut, her cold and systematic could be felt. Another accomplice confessed that Elizabeth's belief that noble blood was stronger, purer, and more potent sowed the seeds of her destruction. Because once she began to target the innocent daughters of aristocratic families, the political shields around her had collapsed, and the eyes of her protectors had closed in fear. Even a priest serving in the castle had heard the screams echoing during Sunday Mass, but had never been able to report them. Why? Because Elizabeth was a countess, and countesses were considered almost untouchable beyond death and crime. But she was no longer untouchable. The evidence was in plain sight. The bodies were real. The legend of Elizabeth being a misunderstood, innocent noblewoman was shattered. All that remained was the grim trail of dark secrets, pain, and dead bodies. Silent screams echoed behind every stone. If Elizabeth had been peasant, this story would have ended quickly. A swift trial, public execution, and the silence of history. But she was not. She was a noblewoman, and nobility turned everything into the shadow of terrifying political game. She stood at the very center of a network woven with Hungary and Transylvania's most powerful dynasties. Even King Matthias II was indebted to her. He burdened the royal treasury with massive loans that funded his wars. Would he risk tainting the name of that powerful woman? Would she forgive his debt? Or was her downfall a tool for some dark calculations? Herein lay the dark peculiarity. Elizabeth's arrest was not for justice, but to reshuffle the balance of power. The task was given to Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary and the king's right-hand man. But Thurzo was not a neutral official. He was related to the Bathory family by blood and looked out for his own interests. On a cold December night in 1610, Thurzo organized a terrifying raid on Countess Castle. Elizabeth was caught in the act, among blood-stained girls, next to a dead body. The letter sent to the king that night began with a trembling sentence. "Your Majesty, I have caught the infamous Lady Bathory in the act." This was a theatrical and deeply political move. From that moment on, Elizabeth Bathory would never walk free again. Under the shadow of the torture and death of more than 80, or maybe even more than 600 innocent girls, it was expected that she would face a public trial. But in the dark labyrinths of history, this did not happen. Her servants were brought to courts, questioned, convicted, and quietly disposed of. But Elizabeth? She was never accused, never tried. She was never allowed to defend herself. Why? Because judging her would have exposed a dark secret that the nobles wanted to ignore. It would have meant admitting that an aristocrat, a woman carrying their lineage and wealth, could turn into a real monster. And this would have exposed the savage, terrifying truth behind the royal facade. What if Elizabeth had spoken? What if she had named other nobles who had helped her, watched, or participated in her tortures? What if she had revealed that not all the girls were abducted, that some had been brought there by their own will? Silencing her was not about mercy, but about survival. Not hers, but others. Thus, instead of putting on a public spectacle, they offered her own hell. Elizabeth was imprisoned in her own tower in Countess Castle. Bricks sealed the door, and food was passed through a narrow slit in the wall. No court, no visitors, no sunlight. Just 4 years of solitude, for years of silent death, hidden from the eyes of the world. Meanwhile, her most loyal helpers were mercilessly eliminated. Ilona, Dorota Senes, Katerina Benica. They were tortured, then burned alive. Their confessions satisfied the public. Elizabeth's silence was enough for the crown. Her final years passed like a nightmare of her own making. Isolated, forgotten, and left to rot. Officials reported that her health faded fast. She stopped eating, whispered to herself, and spoke no words. And on the night of August 21st, 1614, she was found dead in her dark room. No ceremony, no autopsy. She had simply ceased to exist. She was 54 years old. Her first burial was in the vault of the village church. But the villagers fiercely resisted. They did not want her there, not even next to their families. According to legend, her body was silently moved to the Bathory family estate, but the truth was never fully known. To this day, her final resting place remains a secret. Official records erased her name. Her portraits were hidden. Her very existence was as if wiped from the pages of history, like a dark shadow. Her castle still stands tall, but it is no longer a noble estate, but a haunt of whispering ghosts and shadows, known as a cursed ruin. Even though she seems to be buried, the story has not died, because a darkness like that cannot be destroyed. The shadow that remains grows darker, more formless with time. Decades after Elizabeth's death, the whispers and legends began to twist with a dark touch. She was no longer just a killer, but was spoken of as a superhuman entity. A noblewoman who bathed in the blood of virgins to sustain her youth, who fed on beauty, who drained the innocence of girls for her own power and eternity, a vampire. Gothic writers of the 18th and 19th centuries could not resist her. They took the real horror of Countess and turned it into dark legends. Every new story added a detail a little darker, a little more terrifying. She drank blood from golden goblets, hung girls for weeks, slowly draining them, slept in coffins, feasted on flesh, and dealt in dark magic. None of this was in the court records, but it didn't matter. It felt true. When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, he was partly inspired by the real-life Vlad the Impaler. However, Many Dark Souls believe that the legend of Elizabeth shaped his portrayal of the alluring and bloodthirsty vampire, a beautiful, cold, immortal, and deadly noblewoman who feeds on the lives of the young to preserve her power. By the 20th century, Elizabeth Bathory was no longer a historical figure. She had become a living symbol of fear, an immortal archetype of Gothic fantasy. Books, films, operas, metal bands, fashion campaigns. Her pale, elegant, blood-stained image had become a symbol of darkness and horror. Stay Alive, Bathory, Countess of Blood, and countless films have reinterpreted her story. TV shows have borrowed her silhouette to create seductive and terrifying villains. Bands like Cradle of Filth have dedicated entire albums to her legend. She still lives on, not just as a killer, but as a dark and captivating legend, a cultural shadow. But why does she still captivate our souls? While thousands of killers have been lost to the pages of history, why does Elizabeth Bathory still wander in our imagination like a dark ghost, trembling before our eyes with a chilling whisper? It's not just the violence itself. It's the dreadful, ominous union of beauty, power, and fear that she represents. For centuries, society has punished women who try to preserve their youth, who resist aging, and who refuse to fade quietly. Elizabeth not only resisted time, she fought against it savagely. She was educated, powerful, and gave commands. But her legacy is not just this. The real horror is hidden in the rumors about how far she went to preserve her beauty. Whether the stories are true or legend doesn't matter. They leave a shiver in our veins. A woman who refused to age. A woman who drained the youth of others to hold on to her own. A woman who turned beauty into a weapon woven with power and death. And in a world that equates youth with value, this terrifies us. Even the bloodbath legend echoes a deeper fear. The fear that women would do anything for beauty, that they could turn into monsters. It echoes everywhere, in fairy tales, in vampire legends, in today's glossy world of beauty. Elizabeth Bathory is the darkest, most aesthetic version of this fear. A dark mirror we can't take our eyes off, but dare not look into. Even 4 centuries after her death, Elizabeth Bathory is still very much alive. Not in flesh and bone, but in books, in nightmares, in every corner of dark fantasy. Her legend changes as it's told. Feminist icon, serial killer, vampire, scapegoat. Maybe all, maybe none. But that ambiguity makes her immortal, because history is full of monsters. But the ones we can almost understand, they are the ones who hold our souls captive forever. Did she really bathe in blood? Perhaps not. But we have been bathing in her dark story ever since. And perhaps this is the most terrifying truth about her, about us. If this story has settled in your soul, made you ask dark questions about history, or sent shivers down your spine, subscribe. There are countless more cursed secrets to uncover. Leave a comment. Which dark, striking story do you want me to unlock next? Where are you watching this video from? The US, Canada, or the UK?